Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. So this morning, we're going to be talking about migrating the FME community, which is a huge project that was undertaken by our team, along with many other teams in SAFE, to move our FME community to be hosted by a new platform. So this morning, we have myself, my name is Holly Coxon, and then we also have Sienna and Nathan from the team. So we are all FME server technology experts, and our team was tasked with the problem or the challenge of moving all of the data, so all of the questions, articles, and ideas between the old and the new communities. So today, that's what we're here to talk to you about. So I think now we're going to turn off our cameras just to try and make sure we don't hit any snags with the live stream. And of course, as Elizabeth mentioned, Laura's on Q&A, and myself, Sienna, and Nathan, when we're not presenting, will also be able to answer any questions you might have. So please, anything that we're talking about, if you want more clarification or you're interested in learning more, then definitely shoot us a message in that QA panel. So today we're going to start by introducing you to the FME community, and before we move on to speak in more detail about this recent community migration. So on this topic, we'll start by explaining why we used FME. And then other than the immediately obvious answer there, we want to break down why this was actually the best tool to use for the migration process. So then we're going to talk about the three main stages within the process. And for the majority of the session, we'd like to do more of a technical deep dive where we'll walk you through some of the key challenges that we faced and some of the top takeaways that we learned from being involved in this project. So again, as I said, if you have any questions about the concepts that we're explaining, please reach out via the QA panel. And there'll be some time throughout the talk where we'll check in and share any of these questions with the audience as a whole as well. So the overall focus of this webinar is to demonstrate how you can automate the migration of data with FME. So for this particular project, we did not use any other tools or software to complete the migration. So we used FME to complete this entire process. So hopefully most of you are already aware of the FME community, but just in case, this platform aims to provide a space where you can find out everything you need to know about working with FME. So as well as an extensive knowledge base, you can get product support from both SAFE and other users by asking questions in any of our discussion forums. And aside from product support, this is a place where users can come together to share product enhancement ideas, share stories of how they've used FME within their organization. And whilst we're at it, we aim to have some fun by playing FME-driven games as well. So before we dive into the migration process, I'd like to take a moment to gauge how much you as an audience currently interact with the FME community. And of course, if you don't feel like you fall into any of these categories, please just send us a message via the QA panel about how you best use the community as well.
All right, we'll just leave the poll open another 10 seconds or so. Okay, and I'll close the poll in just a few seconds here.
Okay, so hopefully you can see all those results on your screen. So this is great for us to see. In it looks like we have a whole range of FME community users. So there's quite a number of you out there that have not heard of the FME community before. So I'm glad that today that we're able to change that, and hopefully this can be a resource for you as you use FME moving forward. And it's great to see that we also have a few people that are on there also answering questions as well and sharing their knowledge of FME with other users. Okay, so thanks for that, Elizabeth. So what exactly is or was the community migration project? So for the past 5 years, the FME community has been hosted by a third-party vendor, Answerhub. And the FME community has been around much, much longer than that, and has undergone many transformations over the years. So the reason for this most recent change was not because there was anything in particular that was wrong with Answerhub, but rather we saw a number of benefits with hosting the community over on the new platform, Salesforce. So Salesforce is the customer relationship management program that's used across many of the departments at Safe Software. So for the customer success team, this is how we already interact with our users through support cases, and more recently, how we communicate via our live chat support as well. Therefore, the ability to consolidate all of this customer information into a single source was a key reason for the change, as it enabled us to make the most of the data we have available to us. So at this point, I'm going to pass over to Nathan to explain why FME was the best tool to do the job.
Great. Thanks, Holly. Let me just click a button here and show my screen. How does that look?
Great.
Nice. Great. So yeah, why did we use FME to perform our community migration? Aside from the obvious bias, being safe software, there were some really important reasons to choose it, all of which I think contributed to the ease and efficiency overall of this migration project. So moving a community from one platform to another involves a ton of moving parts. From a kind of data perspective, to general goals were to preserve legacy information and accurately and efficiently load that information into the new platform. To achieve this, we needed a tool that could do quite a number of things. Interface with databases, where we would dump data, store it temporarily before pushing to Salesforce. We needed a tool that could leverage REST APIs for both Answerhub and Salesforce for fetching and pushing data. This tool needed to provide extensive data transformation, including things like quality control and data validation. It needed to enable us to rapidly develop version and also share our work between our teams so we could collaborate and solve problems together and find the most efficient workflows to solve the problems that we came across. We also needed it to automate testing and production and make that easy and efficient to run workspaces, rerun workspaces, and nail down the process. We also needed notifications and logging to keep track of errors and keep ourselves informed of what the processes were doing and how they were going along. So I think the key takeaway here is really that FME is an all-in-one tool for this job. Looking at this list of requirements, I think really the only alternatives that you could go to would be using a bunch of different, more focused tools and spending more time and work and headache getting them to work together and orchestrating all of that, or building a custom coded solution, which would have lost us time and resulted in something kind of unwieldy that might be difficult to share, repeat, or learn from also as FME experts and FME users. So migrating data between platforms will always be challenging, but FME has the tools to help. So we like to talk about how easy everything is with FME, And honestly, relative to other tools or custom code, I think it really is easy. But of course, we hit hurdles and had lots of data problems and challenges to overcome, as should be the case with really any big data project. But we did find that FME was always up to the task. And we'll talk about some of those challenges a bit later as well. So yeah, it's frustrating to leave your data in a platform that doesn't work for your needs. So I've talked about why we've used FME and how it can simplify a data migration project. And this slide's really just meant to emphasize that and also uncover a bit more of the reasoning behind the community migration in the first place. And again, it really comes down to the data. We had our community data in a platform that didn't allow us to maximize it and take the full advantage of it. And whether that means offering a better experience to users through live chat, support case updates, or general ease of use, or whether that means providing our internal teams access to harmonized, holistic picture of our business and customer relationships. So we saw the value of moving to a platform that would allow us to harmonize all of this, get this data into one sort of tool and get real value out of it. And we also saw the potential of FME to enable this move. So we really just went for it. And for any folks out there listening who might be new to Safe Software and maybe new to FME, or even if you aren't, but you're looking to expand or tackle new projects with FME, our team of experts is definitely here to help. The three of us are really just a small part of a much larger team that covers the entire FME platform, from FME Desktop to FME Server to FME Cloud. And we'd love to talk to you and help you get started on your FME journey, whatever that might be. You know, whether it is looking at a data migration project, or maybe it's an enterprise application integration project, or maybe automating workflows, GIS or non-spatial.
So
All right,
throughout
and
this,
now,
oh, sorry, Nathan.
sorry, go ahead, Sienna.
So throughout this project, we had three main stages. The first is we had to fetch all the data from Answerhub. We did that through their REST API. And then we had to push all that data back into Salesforce. And then we had to automate this process so we'd be able to run it at the right time. So we shut down the community for, I believe it was 3 days. We weren't allowing people to post. And in that time, in the background, our automations were running and pushing all that brand new data into Salesforce. Would you mind flipping the slide, Nathan? So our first step here was fetching the data from Answerhub. And this step honestly was relatively easy. We're able to accomplish this. I believe it took me maybe a day, 2 days to really get my head around this. But all we had to do was make calls up to the Answerhub REST API, and we did that using the HTTP caller. And then with the responses, we had to format them appropriately. So typically in a REST API, your response will be JSON. So we used our JSON transformers to parse apart those responses and put them into attributes. We also used the attribute manager throughout this whole project so many times because there are so many attributes we had to manage in the proper way, whether it's removing a string from them or just reordering them so that they're in a way that made sense. We'd use the attribute manager for that. Finally, something I hadn't touched before, but I thought was really useful was the list concatenator. So if you've worked with lists before in FME, I think they can be a little overwhelming for new users. A really good option if you are a little overwhelmed by list is to use the list concatenator, and it basically makes a comma separated string for all of your list values. So it's something that's really easy to use and you don't have to worry about your list anymore. And that's how we stored a lot of our topics from the old Answerhub community in a staging database. And Holly will touch a little bit more about how we handle topics later on. So after that, we had to push our data into Salesforce. So this sounds really easy to do, but actually this was the most complicated part of our process because there's so many things we had to account for. Particularly, the hardest challenges we faced were replacing the images that were stored in the Knowledge Center and also stripping out unsupported HTML. So Salesforce doesn't support a lot of HTML tags that we're used to supporting in Answerhub. And so if we try to push up an unsupported HTML tag, it would just reject that whole feature and it wouldn't publish. So we really had to go through and pick out all those HTML tags from our HTML bodies to get this to work. And Nathan will be talking about that a little later on. As well as some key components to this would be mapping topics. Holly's talking about this, and also just joining all of our databases together because we stored our information in a lot of different database tables. Finally, I just wanted to show a picture of what one of these workspaces looked like. So as you can see, this is quite a complicated process. Oh, sorry, yeah, the next one. This was quite a complicated process because there's so many little steps and so many things we need to think about. However, I thought Holly did a beautiful job of organizing a complex workflow really well. One thing that I really liked that she did was having bookmarks nested within bookmarks. So each of those small components had a label to them and be really easy for someone to go through and look through and discover what she did. A big part of this was sharing amongst us because we all had a small section to move over within the community. And we're able to do that really well using FME and then sharing our workspaces because we can go through and look and say, oh, this is how Holly handled attributes or images. And then I could take that for myself. And we definitely did do a lot of sharing that way. So that's also another advantage over using like a custom code option is this self-documents for you. And you can make some, like, I think this is a really beautiful workflow that can then be shared to other users.
Cool. And then, yeah, we also made use of FME Server to kind of make things easier for ourselves when we were running parts of this process. So in this example, FME Server was helpful because we could kickstart a process as soon as the other one had finished, rather than having to constantly check back on our local environment or like, you know, an FME workspace running on our desktop machine. In the screenshot, you can see that the merge action is kind of center point here. This was really useful because we could have all the workspaces, for instance, fetching data from Answerhub running in parallel here. So that's the first kind of 4 workspace actions. Those all feed into a merge action, which will wait until they're all finished before kicking off the next section, which was actually the posting of all that data to Salesforce. Yeah, really FME Server just useful. You know, we could spin up like for instance, a virtual machine, kind of beefy, great network speed, lots of memory and processing power, and sort of just run it without having to worry about our local machine getting bogged down. And some of these processes took quite a while as well. For instance, the process of loading questions into Salesforce took about 24 hours. So there was no way that was going to be just running on a local machine. Getting a little bit of lag on the slides here. Okay, I think that's changed now. Okay, so this is just another example of an FME Server automation. This one is used to post questions, comments, and answers to Salesforce. And just an example of, instead of running in parallel, different processes running in sequence, just to control the flow of this migration process. And in this case, if any one of these workspaces fails, an email notification goes out, which would help determine whether that workspace should be run again or tweaked a bit. And modularizing the workspaces in this way was really helpful for error handling, as it makes workspace troubleshooting easier because they end up being smaller, and allows you to really only rerun what fails and kind of save what was successful. Okay, before jumping into more of the challenges and tips and demos, I just wanted to take a moment to check in with Laura and see if there are any questions to highlight. And we'll have another QA session at the end as well, but we just thought we'd throw it in here as well.
Hey, yeah, so we saw a couple questions just come in quickly. So the first one is that green schedule piece only available on server. So I think you were showing that in one of your last slides here. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so that is definitely a feature of FME Server. And yeah, this is the schedule just built into an automation. I actually didn't schedule this. I just used the schedule because it has a little trigger button and I could just trigger the automation essentially at my will. But yes, that's an FME Server feature. Excellent question.
Awesome. So the other question here was just asking about the input data. Did it need to have a common ID? So I guess that's moving across or being able to piece it together.
Yeah, we definitely made use of, you know, unique IDs, parent IDs, child IDs, a bit of complex relationships going on between the different items, ideas and responses to ideas, questions, answers, comments. And yeah, those IDs needed to be maintained throughout the process and joined in various places to get all the data coming across in a holistic fashion.
I'll also just chime in to add that luckily for us with Answerhub, when we were pulling down that data, it already had all of these IDs assigned to it. So by fetching the data off of Answerhub, we already knew all of these relationships based on those IDs. So it's not like we were needing to assign IDs ourselves in order to make these joins. The data already had that readily available for us. Okay. Doesn't look like there's any other questions, so I'll jump back in here. So hopefully now everyone can see the challenges and top tips screen there.
Yes, we can.
Yep. Okay, perfect. Okay. So for the remainder of this session, we are going to be running through a handful of challenges that we faced and demonstrate how we dealt with these, and hopefully leave you with some top tips for your future data migration tasks as well. So we're going to be highlighting 4 challenges and how we overcame these. And whilst these are not the only challenges that we faced, they were definitely significant hurdles where we all came together as a team to determine the best approach. So we're going to talk about looping within custom transformers and also natural language processing. And then I'll be passing it over to Nathan to talk about how we did integrate some Python into our workflows before Sienna is going to explain adjacent attribute handling to us as well. So there were 2 different scenarios in which we actually enabled looping in a custom transformer. The first was to page through Answerhub responses to make sure that we were fetching all of the data about our questions, articles, and ideas. And the second was actually to retrieve nested comments information. So for today's demo, I'll focus on how we went about retrieving all comments belonging to a reply to one of our articles, questions or ideas. So the main challenge here was that the IDs for any nested comments were not known, before we made the request to the parent comment. So this ID was required in the request URL to then fetch the information on that comment. So since we didn't know this before we started making those calls, we were able to resolve this issue by building a custom transformer. And what this did was it allowed us to create a loop so that we could fetch IDs and then pass them back in to make the next request. And this meant that we were then able to record data for every single comment within our working database to make sure that it all was eventually posted to Salesforce. So in this top flow diagram here, I have an example of a comment structure. So here I'll be referring to a parent-child relationship. So in this example, I have a single parent comment. So this is the first response to a question, article, or idea. And then once that's been posted, you actually have the option to reply directly to that comment rather than replying to the article itself. So from here on, I'm going to be referring to these as child comments. And then from that level, you have the option to reply again to the parent comment or to start replying directly to these child comments. So it can start to build up quite a complex structure of comments that we need to pull down from Answerhub. And as I mentioned, this is an unknown and can actually stretch much wider vertically and horizontally as well. So you can start to see more and more child comment levels build up. So what we have in our initial, the initial information that we have from our article is this parent comment ID. And that's the only information that is known to us. So in our first request, what we do is we make a call to this parent ID. And that's going to return the body, the username, everything about this parent comment. And it's also going to provide us with a list of the very first level of child comments. But even this parent comment doesn't have any information on these child comments further down within this structure. So at that point, what we need to do is then treat the first two child comment IDs as the parent. And this is where the loop is going to come into play. So we have a list of these IDs, and then we're going to feed these back into the initial request, where we can then gain access to the next level of child comments. And then we need to repeat this looping process, basically all the way down until there are no more child IDs being returned. So again, these two become the parent. And at this point, this is the end of this line, but we still have one more child comment here. So this gets sent back into the initial request, where then again, this becomes the end of that loop. And this is something that we had to basically keep repeating on every single parent-child relationship. So I'm not going to do a full demo, but I just thought I would jump into the workspace that I used here, just to try and explain custom transformers and looping for anybody that hasn't seen these before. So when I create a custom transformer, what happens is you'll see I have these green input and output. They're not really transformers, but what they're representing is simply the input and output arrow. Let me just zoom in here on what's going to be your total transformer. So in fact, if you haven't actually used custom transformers at all, and all they're actually doing is they're providing a wrapper around a series of other transformers that you're chaining together. So this is what's going to be on my main workspace, but behind the scenes, these are all the transformers that are actually involved in the feature passing through. And the reason that I needed to make this as a custom transformer is because this is the only way that I have access to add in this loop. So what's happening here is in my main workflow, I've processed all of the parent IDs and I have my first list of child IDs. So the first thing that I need to do is actually use the list exploder, and that's going to bring all of those child IDs out into an attribute. And I need that in my following HTTP caller. Apologies, it's a little bit small, but hopefully you can see here, I have this @value comment IDs in my request URL. So what that means is that I'm going to be making this request for every single child ID that was within this list. And this response is returned at JSON, so I have to process this JSON to actually extract various information from the response request, which I'm then using to check for any child comment IDs. I'm doing that using a string searcher. And then if there are more child IDs, what I'm doing is I'm sending it through this matched port. I'm renaming the child to become the parent ID attribute, when it can then be fed back into this loop, which is how it's being received in here. So it's doing this loop, and then it's going back into here. And then the other thing I have is my output port. So of course, all the information from the comments, whether they have any more children comments or not, I want all of that to be sent out into my workflow for further processing, to be pushed into that Salesforce database. So for nested comments, the custom transformer loop was the perfect solution because there were so many unknowns within this data. However, the second reason that we ended up using a loop was to help us iterate through multiple pages of request data. And in this case, the cloner actually may have been a good alternative. So for paging data, the loop was designed to pull the current page number, add 1 using the expression evaluator, and then we passed this through the loop until we reached the final page number, at which point the loop ended. However, unlike nested comments, we actually did know the total page number after we made the very first request. So instead, what we could have done is fed this total page number into a cloner, and this would have created a feature for each page number that we could have used in the HTTP caller. So definitely, if you are leaning towards using a loop, definitely evaluate whether that is the best solution. So there are often multiple solutions to a single problem, and non-looping solutions we find are usually quicker. They're definitely going to be easier to create, and you can see better performance as well. So I'll definitely point all of you to this question of the week. If you were new to the FME community in that first poll, this is a great opportunity for you to go in there and take a look. And one of our colleagues releases a question of the week where he takes a question by a customer and kind of expands on this in a lot more detail. So recently he posted a question about whether or not to use looping within your workflow. Okay, so our second challenge or top tip is to actually take advantage of the natural language processing tools that FME has available. So in Answerhub, users and staffers were able to enter any text value and any number of topics whenever they created a post. However, in the new community, we actually have a designated number of capabilities forum discussions. So therefore, we need to determine how to map these thousands of topics into these new categories and make sure that those are the ones that most accurately represent what that post was about. So it definitely took some time to determine the best approach. And of course, our first idea here was to use some kind of attribute value mapping. However, this would be extremely time consuming. And instead, we settled on using these natural language processing tools to train a model to actually recognize words and categorize them for us. So this was really important in ensuring that the questions, articles, and ideas are located in the correct forums on the new community. So here's just a nice word graph that you can see some of the most popular topics that we used, and this was for questions. So what you'll notice is this included a lot of different formats, but on the other hand, there are a huge number of topic words that had actually just been used one time. And commonly, there were also words that either had a typo or a different variation of the same word. So for example, you can see writers here, and then we have writer as well. And both of these are obviously quite popular words where really they could just fall into the same category, but it's just the way that people are specifying when they had the freedom to write this out themselves. So again, I'm just going to dive out and kind of talk about this in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to start by showing you what we had to start with. So we had a series of Google Sheets, one for our questions, ideas, and articles. And here we had a list of all of the topics that were being used in Answerhub, as well as how many times they'd been used. So here we have an example. As you can see, we have multiple references to CSV. All of these probably could fall into the same category. And you see here we have CSW, which I suspect is a typo there. And then if we go up, you can see people have even specified basically entire sentences as this topic. So create new data file and find out features with same attributes. So of course, that's very unique. And it's not something that's going to allow people to find this question. And then one funny one is we also just have a tag for Dale. So obviously, this is maybe a way to try and get his attention to get him to help out here. So what we needed to do within these first topics in order to create a model is first you need to create a training data set. So we actually needed to manually go in and assign some labels to these topics, and then this would be used eventually to create a model where we could allocate these to the rest of the data. So if I jump over to articles, what you can see now is I have this third column label, and I've been able to take all of these labels are the new categories within the Salesforce hosted FME community. And so I've been taking words, and of course it is subjective, but making a decision on which category I think these best fall into. So for example, anything that was just a format, so shapefiles, CSV, I would give the formats and applications label. And so what you'll see is a lot of these are also blank. And that's because I don't want to be doing all the work. The entire point of this is to simply create a training data set that I can feed into my transformers within FME to then create the rest of the model for me. So if I dive over to FME now, this is the workspace that I use to train the model. So it's extremely simple. And the first thing I have is my reader, which is bringing in all of those topics from that Google Sheet. So this is the list for articles. So there were just under 1,000 for my article topics. And then the first thing that I need to do is, of course, I only want to use features that I have given a label to train my model. So I just added in a tester here. And then the important transformer we have here is the NLP trainer. And this is what's actually going to be used to create our model. And it has a series of different parameters available to us. We have a couple of different models that can be used. And then we need to specify the label and also the original text this model is being created for. And then we have a series of these NLP features. And this is basically going to be telling the model what it should be looking for when it's training the data set. So in our case, I've said, does it contain a common word? Okay, if it says CSV or CSV reader, if I labeled CSV, then CSV reader should take the same label because they have a word in common. And then I've also said, look out for the ending 3 characters being the same. So these are completely customizable. You have the option to add contains regex, look for beginning characters, look for the length of words as well. And then for all of these things, you can then set a value there as well. And then lastly, we'll specify as well a percentage of data for testing. So of these 369 features, once you've created the model, test it on 20% for accuracy. So then once I've run this through the model, what it's actually done is it's created simply an FMD file. And the output has given me an estimated accuracy. So in this case, with these current settings, it's saying I think there's about 54–55% accuracy of this model labeling these data sets. So at this point, once you've got your model, the next step was to actually test it. So if I jump back into my Google Sheet, I have a second one over here. And this is an example of the data I was actually getting in from Answerhub. So I have a list of all of my articles, and then the topics were simply stored in a comma-separated list. So this is what Sienna mentioned we use the list concatenator for, because a lot of our items had multiple topics. So what was going to happen is I'm going to feed these topics into our model, and it will make a label based on all of these topics. So at that point, I'm using the NLP classifier. So this is really the trainer's pair transformer. And all you do is feed in the model and specify the text to classify, and it does the rest of the work for you. So I do have a couple of rejected features, and this is simply because there were a few articles that did not have topics. So now if I jump back over to Google Sheets, it's just slightly easier to zoom in here than it is on FME. So hopefully everybody can see this. You'll see I have this final column NLP label. And at this point, all of my articles have now been given a label. And it's definitely not going to be perfect. Obviously, that training model was about 50% accuracy. So it's something that you're going to want to run and run again until you're happy with the quality of the labels, and most of them look accurate to you. So my main tip for actually building these training models is definitely the larger training set you can provide, the more accurate the final model will be. So I think we started out by labeling around 100 topics. And in the end, you can see there I had well over 300 topics labeled for my training data set. And then the second thing that I'll mention is experiment with different model types. So one of the models there will go through 100 iterations while it is actually running. So this takes a little bit longer to train the model or to run that workspace, but probably the result may be more accurate at the end because of those additional iterations through the data set to refine that information. And lastly as well, experiment with the different NLP feature parameters that need to be met. So overall, this definitely is still going to take some time investment, but it's going to save you in the long run a huge amount of time. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Nathan to speak about Python workflows.
Perfect, thanks Holly. Let me get my screen going here. How does that look?
Great, looks good.
Awesome, cool. So yeah, another challenge that we encountered, which I think we've kind of been mentioning throughout, is this challenge of dealing with HTML. We needed to clean and strip invalid HTML and do things like find and replace URLs. This can be a bit hard and difficult in FME. Using FME's attribute, string, and XML transformers. Can be difficult to make multiple edits in one sort of chunk of HTML stored in an attribute. One solution, just one solution, is Python callers placed in key locations in the workflow with short sort of data wrangling scripts. And sort of how that worked was using Python's BeautifulSoup library, which actually is shipped with FME. And one thing that I learned, and is kind of a gotcha if you're going to go this route with data wrangling with Python, is exception handling. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment here. So HTML can be difficult to work with because it's not really fully structured data. There are tags and a loose hierarchy, but the order of all this is fluid. And the data that's contained in those tags or between those tags is really extremely variable, especially when we've got users posting text to a forum. So whether it's that text or even the source URL of images, lots of variation that we found there. And yeah, so because Answerhub is far less strict about these tags and the type of content that's allowed, this proved difficult on the Salesforce side, which is very strict, allowing only a handful of tags and requiring only certain formatting rules for things like URLs and images. So a bit later, Sienna is going to talk about a related and alternative approach to this one with adjacent attribute handling, and I won't spoil too much of that. But I just do want to mention that there are some other common FME tools for working with this kind of data, but some of the other ones tend to struggle to effectively manipulate this unstructured data in place. And using them tends to get kind of exponentially more difficult based on the complexity of that HTML that needs editing. So I'm thinking about string replacers, which can only work on one specific chunk of text at a time for one specific case. I'm thinking also about the HTML extractor, which can be really useful for parsing HTML, but can't really be used to edit it. And I'm thinking also of XML transformers, which can help parse and edit, but if you go that route, you do end up working with a lot of FME lists and difficulty as well making multiple edits to the same body of HTML. So I'm really not a Python developer, but as people like to say, I know enough to be dangerous. And as soon as I found out about this BeautifulSoup Python library and that it's shipped with FME by default, I figured why not take a stab at it for this kind of difficult problem. So BeautifulSoup allows a chunk of HTML to be worked on as an object in Python. As you can kind of see in this GIF here, the structure can be traversed easily. You've got handy methods for finding all image tags, for example, getting at those source URL attributes, and editing all of these structures in place. So it really allowed me to replace, tens of FME transformers with a few lines of code in most cases. So offloading some of that data manipulation to Python also meant that I could use loops and conditions to manipulate the HTML without having to worry at all about working with features or FME lists or any of the other attribute data attached to those features. I could use standard libraries to fill in any gaps that I needed, like requests. Of course, it is a bit of a double-edged sword. The key gotcha in all this is that with all this added control of working in Python, you do kind of need to manage that yourself. There's no rejected port on a Python caller, for example. So what I quickly realized was that this enormous variability in the HTML data that we were all working with, errors would happen, translations would terminate, and data would be lost unless some sort of error handling, exception handling was built in there. So in this example you see here, and that I'll demo in a second, the goal is to make a test request to each image URL in a question body. So I start by getting the HTML body from the FME feature and creating a BeautifulSoup object out of that HTML body. So that's the soup here in the code. I like that it's called soup. I loop through all the images in that object and try a series of requests to check if the URL is good. If the request isn't successful, it's a bad link and won't be accepted by Salesforce, so that image should really be removed. BeautifulSoup has a handy built-in method called decompose just for that. And very often with a bad request, you'll get a Python exception because the URL is either malformed or times out, something like this. And I knew generally what the issue would be. So I wrapped my request in a try statement and followed it up with an accept statement that would try the URL again, but with some fixes to it, adding the protocol and the Answerhub domain there. Even if that didn't work, a final accept clause would allow the code to fail gracefully, so I could manually intervene in the data downstream. Something downstream would catch any problems, and then I could just edit that image myself. In all cases, the last line resets my FME attribute to the BeautifulSoup object I was working with in the code, so I could update my body with the results from this code. Great, so I'll just jump out really quickly into a demo. It's not meant to go really in depth into the data, but just to kind of illustrate that exception that can rise and how it can be handled. So you can see here, just this is some actually raw data from our migration. Quite a bit of attributes here. The most important one just being the body, which is the HTML. And if I run this Python caller here, which doesn't have any exception handling at all, but just runs through all those images and tries to test if it's a good request, you'll see pretty quick an exception raised because this URL is invalid in its current form. So I've got a missing schema exception. So at this point, translation failed, nothing really good coming of that. And in this example, I've got my try and accept going on here. So any failures will be gracefully handled, and the translation will be able to continue. This will take a couple of seconds just because each of those requests will actually theoretically succeed in this case. And there we go, no exceptions in that case. All right, this is that same slide. I just wanted to kind of wrap up on this. The key takeaway here in my mind is that, you know, a little injected Python can help tackle some intricate or niche data problems, editing HTML being one of them. And it's definitely worth looking into since we do have those dedicated Python transformers. And for instance, BeautifulSoup is shipped with FME. But just be cautious as you work in the code. As I learned, you'll need to handle the data with more control than you might with typical FME transformers. All right, at this time, I'll pass it off to Sienna to wrap up.
All right, so we are running a little low on time. I don't think we should be too much over. I just have my demo to do and then some outro slides. But if you do need to go, this is totally recorded. So feel free, if you need to leave, just leave, and then you can come back and watch the rest of the demo. So I'll be discussing adjacent attribute handling. So with our workflow, we had to go in and replace all the images within an HTML body. So this could be 2, this could be 3, it could be even more than that, depending on the article or idea that we were working with. We tried to use a string replacer to do this because it seemed like the obvious choice. We wanted to replace the strings of one image to another. However, since we had multiple features coming through, this didn't really work out for us because it would only replace one string per HTML body, and it wouldn't replace multiple strings in one HTML body. So our solution was to use adjacent attribute handling in the attribute manager to successfully replace all the URLs. So I'll just show you an example of an idea that I worked with. So here we can see we have 2 images. Both of these images would be their own feature that I'm feeding in. So if I use the string replacer, it would look like this. I have one of my good URLs that I want to replace in that same HTML body. It would do that. It would replace that one, but then I'd be left with one bad URL as well. And then for my second feature, it would go through, string replace, but again, I would be left with a bad URL. Instead, using adjacent attribute handling in the attribute manager, it allows me to manipulate other features that are either prior or latter in my workflow. So I was able to replace both of these URLs using adjacent attribute handling. And I'll show that off right now. So this is what my workspace looked like. At first, I'll go through and I'll show you what happened with all of my features as it went through my workspace, and then I'll explain how we did this. So I'll zoom in a little bit more. So the first thing we wanted to do was sort all of our features. We really wanted to make sure that the IDs for our features, in this case, this is my ID, I wanted it to all be together in one clump. So I wasn't working with one idea and then another idea that was totally separate from it. I wanted to sort it so that they're all in one section. Feeding into this, I had my body as HTML. So this is the body of the idea. As you can see here, I have two image sources. These image sources are from the Knowledge Center and they need to be replaced. I also have my Salesforce URL, and this is actually what I'm going to be replacing. So I have a Salesforce URL, I have an Answerhub URL, so I know what I need to replace. And then I have two features for one idea. Next, I have an attribute manager, and the output from the attribute manager we'll take a look at now. So my first one, you can see one URL was successfully replaced. This is the Salesforce URL. However, the other one wasn't. But if I look at my second feature, you'll see that both of the URLs were replaced successfully. Then I used a sampler, and I wanted to pick the last feature because I knew that was the successful one. And also, it's important to note here, I grouped it by the ID. And here we can see we have the successful body that will then be output to Salesforce. We can take a closer look of how we set up the attribute manager to do this. So an important note here is this box is checked. Enable adjacent attribute handling. And I was looking at a feature prior to the one I was working with. Then I set up a conditional parameter. So if we click down here, we can set up a conditional value. And it's going to do like an if-else statement. So I'll go through for each feature as it would hit it. So there's a test condition, which is if my ID is equal to 1 prior, then I'm going to use this statement. If that's not true, then I'll use this statement. So I'm going to replace the string. So for our first feature that went through, this is what we did. There was no feature prior to this that shared the same ID. So we're just going to go ahead and do a regular replace string. However, for the next feature that went through, it did meet this requirement. It was the second feature that shared the same ID. So we're going to do something a little different. Instead of replacing its own body, we're going to take the body of the feature prior to it and replace the URLs there. And that's why I saw my output for this was successful, because I wasn't replacing the body for this current feature. I was taking the body from the prior feature and then doing a string replace there. All right, so that's the end of our demos. We're going to go through and do some wrap-up slides and stay around for a Q&A if you are interested in that. So the big takeaway from this is if you have data that's stuck in a system that's not working for you, you can migrate it out. You can get it out of there and put it into a better system for you. So don't waste the value of your data by having it in a system that's not working for you. So you can do this too. We did it. FME worked great for us because we're able to validate and clean our data along the way. It also allowed us to just take small pieces of this and try that. So we weren't doing this whole migration in one big workflow. We're taking small pieces, testing that out and seeing if that was successful for us. So it's great. It's an iterative approach and it worked really well for us. If you'd want to get started on something like this, there's lots of resources we have. The first one is just our free trials. So we have free trials for lots of things, for desktop and server. So if you are interested in trying that out, I'd recommend clicking that link. We do have a blog on this as well. If you'd like to read into a little more detail on what we did and why we did it, our blog is up. And then finally, if you have the opportunity, I definitely recommend checking out the FME community. While migrating the community, I definitely visited there a lot of times just to check out other people's tips and tricks. And that leaves us with our final QA. So if there is anything that you're curious about or you want us to answer, just let us know. How are the questions looking, Laura?
Hey, so there were a few that were asked earlier that we could maybe discuss to get things going. So one person was asking how long it took to run that full migration.
Yeah, so it's different for everyone. I had ideas, which was a smaller section. So my section only took like maybe 4 hours, 5 hours to run in total, but Nathan was working on questions, which definitely took a lot longer because there's much more stuff there.
Yeah, I found that the actual fetching data from Answerhub was fairly quick, just a few hours, but then that push to Salesforce, that did take, I think it actually ended up being over 24 hours.
We've just had a question come in about the use of badges. So for Nathan, Sienna, and I, we were focusing on questions, articles, and ideas. I'm not 100% sure why the user badges were not carried over. I think, to the best of my knowledge, that we wanted to create or define new badges. So perhaps that's something we can check in with Mark Island and see if he can confirm that for us.
Yeah, the badging system in the new community works differently. So we couldn't find like a one-to-one match for all the old badges to the new ones. So we found it was a better idea just to start fresh. And I think we did give some legacy badges to some of the people who were active on the old community just to have something from being active there. But yeah, unfortunately, not everything could come across.
Yeah, another great question. How long did it take to create these migration workflows? So we initially, I believe, started this project in around November last year. And then, of course, you all saw the migration, which happened in summer. It was July, I think, June or July. So overall, on and off, it probably took us around 6 months. It's not something that we were working on continuously, but definitely did. We went through a rigorous staging and migration as well behind the scenes before we did the final product. So it is something that we were working on for a longer period of time, definitely.
Yeah, I feel like we could have got it done quicker if we didn't care about having all the data come through or having it be as precise as possible and having little manual stuff to do at the end of it. But the goal was really just to do within FME and have like no manual cleanup process afterwards. And to get that, like you have to add in a lot of exceptions. When I found later on was actually iframes. It took me a while to figure out how to extract iframes and push them up somewhere that we could use them. So it's just all the little things that you don't think about that kind of add time on near the end. It looks like there's lots of interest in the NLP transformers though, which is really good.
Yeah, definitely. So the NLP transformers are available as a package on the FME Hub. So I just had a look and it looks like they're available from 2019 onwards. So definitely if you're using FME, which is a version, I can't recall the exact build, I'll send out a link on the chat now. So if that's something that you're interested in, yeah, it looks like if you're build 19231, so I think that will be an early 29.0 build. Definitely something worth checking out. We just had a question. Are there any videos that show how to create your own transformers? I do think we have some resources for creating custom transformers. I'm not sure whether we have any videos or webinars that cover that. So perhaps that's something we can look at, and then we can reach out to this user afterwards with those resources.
It's definitely in the advanced desktop training. So there would be a short section there on it, but we can see what else we have.
Yeah. Okay, I don't think we have any other questions coming in. So I'll hand it over to Elizabeth probably to do a wrap up.
Yeah, thanks so much everyone for coming to listen. Just a note that I did post a link for the FME community. If you do have any questions that pop up after the webinar, please feel free to visit our community. Yeah, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, bye-bye.